The Sun from the Pines, Part 1. The pines stretched endlessly beyond the family's cabin, their needle-sharp branches swaying in a wind that carried a low, mournful hum. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Ethan, his wife Claire, and their 12-year-old son Noah escaping the city for a walk among the trees. Noah had wandered off that first afternoon, chasing a bird's call, his laughter fading into the woods. They searched until dusk, shouting his name, but the forest swallowed every sound, leaving only the hum and eerie drone that lingered in Ethan's ears as night fell. 3 days passed with no trace, the police combing the pines until hope dwindled to a flicker. That evening, as the sun bled red through the branches, Claire screamed. Ethan ran to the porch, and there was Noah, stepping from the trees, his silhouette stark against the fading light. He didn't speak, didn't run. To them, just stood there, his head tilted, his smile crooked too wide for his face. "Noah?" Ethan whispered, stepping closer, but the boy's eyes rolled back white and unseeing, before snapping forward. A whisper slipped from his lips, not his voice, but something low, raspy. "I see you." Claire sobbed, reaching for him, but Ethan grabbed her arm. Something was wrong. Noah's movements were jerky, his steps uneven, like a puppet pulled by unseen strings. The hum buzzed louder now, not from the trees but from him, vibrating through the porch. He smiled again, wider, and shuffled inside, the whisper trailing, "I'm home." Sleep came slow that night, the cabin heavier with silence. Ethan dreamed of pines bending low, their branches whispering, "Noah." He jolted awake, the clock stuck at 3:13 a.m., his breath fogging in the cold. Noah stood in the doorway, his head tilted, eyes rolled back, staring though they couldn't see. The hum pulsed from him, soft and low, threading through the dark. And the whisper came, not a dream, but real. "I see you." Ethan stumbled out of bed, shaking Claire awake, but Noah was gone until they found him in the kitchen, sitting still, his crooked smile fixed, his fingers tapping a rhythm that matched the hum. The next day, he wouldn't eat, wouldn't answer, just sat, head tilted, eyes rolling back when they spoke his name. Claire clung to him, whispering apologies, but his lips parted, the raspy voice cutting through. "I'm home." Ethan watched the shadows in the room, tall, thin, swaying faintly, mirroring Noah's jerky taps. He couldn't shake it. The boy who'd vanished wasn't the boy who'd returned. That night, the hum grew sharper, the shadows bolder, standing in corners, tilting their heads with Noah's. Ethan locked himself in the bathroom, hands trembling, searching online for answers. A local forum mentioned missing hikers in the pines, one survivor claiming, "The trees take you and send something back." The last post chilled him. "Don't look in its eyes." The whisper turned to words that evening, low, insistent, weaving through the hum. "I see you." Noah sat at the table, head tilted, eyes white, his crooked smile stretching as shadows swayed behind him. Claire begged him to speak, but he only tapped faster, the hum pulsing through the cabin, the whisper threading through the walls. Sleep came unbidden, and Ethan stood in the pines, Noah before him, eyes rolled back, whispering, "I'm home." Shadows shifting behind the trees, their heads tilted, watching. He woke gasping, the clock frozen. At 3:13 a.m., Noah beside the bed. He hadn't heard him move, the boy's smile wider, shadows swaying in the dark. The cabin felt smaller, the air thicker, as if Noah watched from every angle. Not Noah, but whatever wore his skin. Ethan tried calling the police, but the phone buzzed with static, the hum drowning the line. The shadows stood closer, tall, thin, faceless, swaying with Noah's rhythm, their heads tilting as if they knew him. The whisper chanted, "I see you." Claire sobbed in the corner, but Noah turned to her, his head jerking, eyes rolling back, the raspy voice cutting through, "I'm home." Ethan turned away, but the window reflected him, head tilted, smile crooked, shadows shifting behind the glass. The survivor's warning burned in his mind. Don't look in its eyes. Sleep eluded him, the hum a roar, the whisper a demand. "I see you." He dreamed, or didn't, of Noah stepping closer. "I'm home." Shadows stretching from the trees, their forms tall and thin, their heads tilted as if they saw him. He woke to the glow of dawn, the clock dead, Noah nearer, his crooked smile typing a rhythm with his fingers, shadows standing still, their presence a cold that sank into his skin. The cabin trembled, the hum a low storm, the whisper insistent, "I see you." Ethan didn't want to, didn't dare, but his eyes met Noah's white, unseeing, endless, the boy's smile stretching, the shadows waiting still, silent, watching. The night stretched on, the cabin's glow bending the light, twisting it into a shimmer that pulsed with the hum. The shadows stood out tall, thin, faceless, watching from the walls, the windows, the dark. The whisper wove through it. I'm home. Ethan tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed, the hum spiking, the shadows tilting closer, their presence a weight that crushed his lungs. The cabin wasn't theirs anymore, it belonged to Noah, to the thing that whispered, to the pines. That sent it back, and they were its captives, trapped by a boy they couldn't save, a hum they couldn't silence. Part 2. The cabin had become a prison under the thing that were Noah's face, its crooked smile a mask for a terror that gnawed at Ethan's every breath. The hum wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence, a low drone that pulls through the walls, the floor, his skull a vibration that sank into his bones, his chest, his soul, tugging at him with every flicker. The clock hadn't moved past 3:13 a.m. Since that first night, its digits flickering like a fading heartbeat, a cruel mockery of time that no longer held. Noah sat in the living room, his head tilted to far, his eyes rolled back to white, his smile stretching wider textbook. Wrong, and the whisper slipped from his lips, raspy and cold. I see you. The hum buzzed louder, threading through the silence, shadows swaying in its rhythm. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by a haze where the hum ruled. Ethan had tried to reach Noah, shook him, shouted his name, but the boy's head jerked. Eyes snapping white, the raspy voice cutting through. I'm home. Claire clung to hope, stroking his hair, but his fingers tapped faster, the hum pulsing sharper, shadows standing closer, tall, thin, faceless, mirroring his rhythm, their heads tilting as if they saw her. Ethan locked the bedroom door, but the hum followed, seeping through the wood, the air, his own breath. Sleep came unbidden, dragging him under, and he stood in the pines, Noah nearer, eyes white, smile crooked, whispering, I see you. Shadows shifting behind the trees, their heads tilted, their forms brushing the edges of his vision. He woke gasping, the clock still at 3:13 a.m. Noah outside the door, he hadn't heard him move, the hum roaring, shadows swaying in the dark, the cabin trembled, the whisper a chant, I'm home. Ethan tried to call for help again, but the phone buzzed with static, the hum drowning every signal. Noah didn't eat, didn't sleep, just sat, head tilted, eyes rolling back when they spoke, his crooked smile stretching as shadows swayed. Behind him, Claire sobbed, begging him to look at her, but his head jerked sideways, the raspy voice threading through. I see you. The shadows grew bolder, standing not just in corners but beside them, tall, thin, faceless, swaying with Noah's taps, their heads tilting to far, their presence a cold that pressed against Ethan's lungs. He turned away, but the mirror reflected them, Noah's face, eyes white, smile wider, shadows shifting behind the glass. The survivor's warning burned in his mind. Don't look in its eyes. The hum turned unbearable that night, pulsing through the cabin like a storm, the whisper a demand. I see you. Noah stood in the hallway, his head tilted, his jerky steps echoing, shadows following, tall, thin, faceless, swaying with his rhythm, their heads tilting as if they knew him. Claire reached for him, but he turned, eyes rolling back, smile stretching beyond his face, the raspy voice roaring, I'm home. Ethan pulled her back, but the room pulsed, the hum bending the light, twisting it into a shimmer that synced with Noah's taps. The shadows tilted closer, their forms human yet wrong, too tall, too thin, too empty, their presence a cold that burned without heat. The cabin darkened, not from night but from the hum's weight, a void that pressed against his chest, his mind, his soul. Sleep swallowed him, or didn't he? Stood in the pines, Noah before him, eyes white, smile crooked, whispering, I see you. Shadows stretching from the trees, their heads tilted, their hands reaching, cold, electric, alive, their heads twitching as if they saw him. He woke to the hum, the clock frozen, Noah closer, his crooked smile wider, shadows swaying beside the bed, their cold sinking into his marrow. The glow of his eyes burned brighter, not eyes, but voids reflecting not the room but them, standing where he stood, shifting where he breathed, whispering where he was silent. I'm home. The cabin was alive with it, the hum pulsed in the pipes, the walls, the air a drone that wouldn't rest. Ethan tried to scream, but his voice hummed instead, a note in their rhythm, a whisper in their chorus. I see you. The shadows stood out, tall, thin, faceless, watching from every corner, every glint, every shadow. Noah moved jerky, unnatural, his head tilting to far, his smile stretching, the hum roaring through his frame. I'm home. Ethan grabbed Claire, pulling her to the bathroom, but the mirror glowed Noah's face, eyes white, shadows shifting. Behind it, their whisper threading through his skull. I see you. The night stretched on, the hum a roar that drowned his thoughts. The shadows inches from them beside them, their forms a mass that pulls with Noah's rhythm. Their whisper a noose tightening with every breath. I'm home. Ethan sank to the floor, hands trembling, the hum searing his vision. The cabin alive with shadows, dozens now, swaying from the walls, the ceiling, the dark. The hum was his heartbeat, the whisper his pulse, the shadows his mirror he didn't know where. He ended and they began. The cabin stilled, the hum a low pulse, Noah standing over them, his crooked smile endless, shadows tilting closer, their presence a cold that sank into his skin. I see you. The room darkened, the hum a thread in the silence, the shadows closer. Their forms hovering cold, relentless, alive. Ethan didn't remember sleeping, didn't remember waking, but the hum knew, threading Noah's whisper through the drone, pulling him deeper. The shadows stood within him, their forms a flicker in his vision, their whisper a chant he couldn't silence. I'm home. Noah pulsed one final time, his head jerked, eyes rolled back, smile stretching, the shadows watching, waiting, claiming a gaze he couldn't escape, a hum he couldn't stop. Ethan tried to fight, to drag Claire out, but the door buzzed cold, alive, the hum spiking, the shadows sharper, their forms swaying in time, their whisper threading through his skull. I see you. The cabin wasn't theirs anymore, it belonged to Noah, to the thing that came from the pines, to the shadows that followed, and they were its captives, trapped in a home they couldn't leave, a drone they couldn't silence. Part 3. The cabin had crumbled beneath the weight of whatever wore Noah's skin, its crooked smile a gateway to a terror that devoured Ethan's every shred of self. The hum wasn't just a sound, it was them, a relentless drone that pulls through their veins, their bones, their souls, a vibration so deep it erased all traces of who they'd been. The clock flickered at 3:13 a.m., its digits trembling. Like a heartbeat on the brink, a cruel anchor in a world that no longer existed. Noah stood in the center of the room, his head tilted to far, his eyes rolled back to endless white, his smile stretching beyond his face, wrong, endless, alive, and the whisper slipped from his lips, raspy and cold. I see you. The hum roared louder, threading through the void, shadows swaying in its rhythm, their forms stark against the walls. Sleep was a lost dream. The boundary between waking and nightmare had shattered under Noah's haunting pulse. Ethan hadn't slept, or had he? But the hum didn't care, dragging him under with its rhythm, its drone a chain that bound his every breath. The shadows weren't just shadows, they were the cabin, the glow, the air, tall, thin, faceless, swaying with Noah's jerky taps, their heads tilting to far, to slow. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence was a cold abyss, a static weight that crushed his chest, chanting his name beneath the hum. I'm home. Claire sobbed beside him, her hands trembling, but her voice hummed too, a note in their rhythm, a whisper in their chorus. The whisper grew sharper, its words a blade that sliced through their will, their sanity, their selves. I see you. Ethan had tried to fight, barricaded the doors, smashed the windows, but the wood pulsed. The glass reflected Noah's face, eyes white, smile crooked, reinstalling itself in every crack they made. The shadows stood within reach now, beside them, behind them, their forms human yet grotesquely wrong, their heads tilting to fast, their silence a scream beneath the drone. Ethan clawed at the walls, desperate for escape, but they pulsed back, soft, alive, humming Noah's whisper. I'm home. The cabin trembled, the hum a storm that shook the void, the whisper a vow. I see you. Noah moved jerky, unnatural, his head tilting to far, his smile stretching as shadows swayed behind him, their forms brushing the walls, their presence endless. Claire reached for him, her voice breaking, but his head jerked, eyes rolling back, the raspy voice roaring. I'm home. Ethan pulled her away, but the room pulsed, the hum bending the light, twisting it into a shimmer that synced with Noah's rhythm. The shadows tilted closer, their forms human yet wrong, too tall, too thin, too empty, their presence a cold that burned without heat. Sleep crashed over him, or didn't he? Stood in the pines, Noah before him, eyes white, smile crooked, whispering, I see you. Shadows stretching from the trees, their heads tilted, their hands reaching, cold, electric, alive, their heads twitching as if they knew him. He woke gasping, or didn't the clock dead? Noah closer, his crooked smile wider, shadows swaying beside him, their cold sinking into his marrow. The glow of his eyes burned not eyes, but voids reflecting not them but the pines standing where they stood, shifting where they breathed, whispering where they were silent. I'm home. The cabin was alive with it, the hum pulsed in. The pipes, the walls, the air a drone that wouldn't rest, wouldn't fade, wouldn't let go. Ethan tried to scream, but his voice hummed instead, a note in their rhythm, a whisper in their chorus. I see you. The shadows stood out tall, thin, faceless, watching from every corner, every glint, every shadow. Noah's head jerked too fast, too wrong, his smile stretching, the hum roaring through his frame. I'm home. Claire sank to her knees, her eyes wide, but they rolled back to white, and seeing the hum threading through her whisper, I see you. The hum turned unbearable, casting a light that didn't illuminate but consumed, its roar a scream that drowned their thoughts. The shadows were within them, beside them, around them, their forms stark, their heads tilting, their presence a cold that devoured their nerves. The cabin trembled, the whisper a tempest. I'm home. Ethan saw them not shadows but echoes, endless loops of despair. Noah swaying in the pines, a woman whispering into nothing, figures shifting in a void that wasn't there. Each one whispered their names, a plea, a claim, pulling them into their abyss. The cabin plunged into a darkness that wasn't absence but presence, a void that pulsed with the hum, its edges brushing their skin, its weight crushing their spirits. Ethan tried to run, but his legs were there, swaying to the rhythm, rooted by a pulse that wasn't his. Noah's eyes burned through him, not eyes, but voids, and he saw not himself but them, his form flickering, breaking, dissolving into the hum. I see you. His breath theirs, his voice theirs. The shadows' hands brushed his face, cold, relentless, alive, the hum roaring, the whisper a noose. I'm home. Sleep was them, or he was them. He stood in the pines. I see you. Noah his mirror, his hands on his wrists, his neck, their rhythm his prison. The hum roared from his throat, his lungs, his soul, a drone that erased him, rewrote him, claimed him. He woke or didn't, the clock dead, Noah within him, his crooked smile endless, shadows swaying through him, their whisper a chant he couldn't stop. I'm home. The hum pulsed. I see you. Noah's head jerking, the shadows watching, waiting, claiming a gaze he couldn't escape, a hum he couldn't silence. The cabin stilled, the hum a low thread, Noah standing, watching, waiting. Ethan didn't know if he stood or sank, didn't know if he breathed or hummed, but Noah knew, threading their names through the drone, stitching them into its abyss. The shadows were them, over them, around them, through them, their forms, eternal, cold, electric, alive, their rhythm a pulse they couldn't break. The cabin was theirs, the pines, the hums, Noah's, and they were theirs, a flicker in the dark, a whisper in the void, souls swaying back from a forest that wouldn't fade. The night stretched on, the hum a whisper on the air. I see you. And then silence, a silence that wasn't empty but alive, waiting, watching. Ethan didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't need to, because he wasn't Ethan anymore. He was theirs, a hum in the void, a sway in the pines, a shadow staring back from a boy that wouldn't stop, an endless echo he couldn't escape, a whisper he couldn't silence. Part 4. The cabin had been obliterated by the thing that wore Noah's skin, its crooked smile a void that swallowed Ethan's every fragment of self. The hum wasn't a sound anymore, it was them, a ceaseless roar that pulls through their veins. Their bones, their souls, a vibration so deep it erased all traces of who they'd once been. The clock flickered faintly at 3:13 a.m., its digits a dying pulse in a reality that had long since collapsed, a cruel echo of a time they couldn't reclaim. Noah stood in the heart of the cabin, his head tilted to far, his eyes rolled back to endless white, his smile stretching beyond his face, wrong, endless, alive, casting a shimmer that consumed the space, twisting it into a prison of whispers and shadows, threading their names through the dark. I see you. Sleep and waking had fused into one, an endless nightmare where the hum reigned supreme. Ethan didn't know if he stood or fell, didn't know if he breathed or hummed, but Noah knew, pulling them under with his rhythm, his drone a chain that owned their every shudder. The shadows weren't separate, they were them, the cabin. The glow, tall, thin, faceless, swaying with Noah's jerky taps, their forms stark against the walls, their heads tilting to far, their presence stretching beyond the edges of sight. They didn't move, didn't touch, but their weight was a cold abyss, a static force that crushed their chests, chanting beneath the hum, I'm home. The whisper was a scream now, its words a blade that sliced through their minds, their wills, their essences. I see you. Ethan had tried to resist, barricaded every exit, burned the furniture, but the wood pulsed. The ashes glowed with Noah's face, eyes white, smile crooked, reinstalling itself in every crack they made. The shadows stood within them, beside them, around them, through them, their forms them yet grotesquely warped, their heads tilting to fast, their silence a roar that drowned their thoughts. Ethan clawed at his skin, desperate for something real, but the hum pulsed beneath his flesh, a rhythm that answered only to Noah. I'm home. The cabin trembled, the hum a tempest that shook the void, the whisper a vow. I see you. Noah moved jerky, unnatural, his head tilting to far, his smile stretching as shadows swayed behind him, their forms brushing them, their presence eternal. Claire reached for him, her hands trembling, but his head jerked, eyes rolling back, the raspy voice roaring, I'm home. Ethan pulled her back, but the room pulsed, the hum bending the light, twisting it into a shimmer that synced with Noah's rhythm. The shadows tilted closer, their forms human, yet wronged, tall, too thin, too empty, their presence a cold that burned without heat. Sleep swallowed them or never left. He stood in the pines, Noah before him, eyes white, smile crooked, whispering, I see you. Through him, their cold sinking into his soul. The glow of his eyes burned not eyes, but voids reflecting not them but the pines, lives they'd never lived, faces they'd never known, each one swaying, whispering their names, pulling them into their abyss. I'm home. The cabin was the hum, the walls breathed it, the floors pulsed it, the air sang it, a drone that wouldn't rest, wouldn't fade, wouldn't release them. Ethan tried to scream, but his voice was theirs, humming their rhythm, whispering their chant. I see you. The shadows stood within them, over them, around them, their forms a mass that pulsed with Noah's rhythm, their hands brushing their eyes, their throats cold, electric, claiming. Noah's head jerked to fast, too wrong, his smile stretching, the hum roaring through his frame. I'm home. Claire's eyes rolled back white, unseeing, her whisper joining his. I see you. The hum seared into their minds, a light that didn't illuminate but consumed, its roar a scream that annihilated their thoughts. The shadows were them, beside them, around them, through them, their forms stark, their heads tilting, their presence a cold that devoured their nerves. The cabin trembled, the whisper a hurricane. I see you. Ethan saw them, not shadows, but souls, endless loops of despair. Noah whispering from the pines, a woman swaying in nothing, figures shifting in a void that wasn't there. Each one whispered their names, a plea, a claim, a curse pulling them into their eternity. The cabin plunged into a darkness that wasn't absence but presence, a void that pulsed with the hum, its edges brushing their skin, its weight erasing their spirits. Ethan tried to run, but his legs were there, swaying to the rhythm, rooted by a pulse that wasn't his. Noah's eyes burned through him, not eyes, but voids, and he saw not himself but them, his form flickering, breaking, dissolving into the hum. I'm home. His breath theirs, his voice theirs, his self theirs. The shadows' hands brushed his face, cold, relentless, alive, the hum roaring, the whisper a noose. I see you. Sleep was them, or they were them. He stood in the pines. I see you. Noah their mirror, his hands on their wrists, their necks, their rhythm, their tomb. The hum roared from their throats, their lungs, their souls, a drone that consumed them, rewrote them, owned them. He woke or didn't, the clock dead. Noah them, his crooked smile endless, shadows swaying through them, their whisper a chant they couldn't stop. I'm home. The hum pulsed one final time. I see you. Noah's head jerking, the shadows watching, waiting, claiming a gaze they couldn't escape, a hum they couldn't silence. Days passed or didn't. The cabin stood empty, dust settling on the floor, the walls silent but alive. A ranger knocked, the door creaking open to stillness. A photo lay in the dust, Ethan, Claire, Noah smiling, its frame humming faintly, a whisper on the air, you're home. The ranger stared, curious, and the mirror glowed, a face not his, eyes white, smile crooked. I see you. Watching. The ranger froze, the hum threading through the silence, whispering his name. I'm home. The shadows shifted, their forms tall and thin, their heads tilting beyond the glass. The hum grew, the whisper a promise. I see you. The cycle turned, the pines reaching, the hum claiming, the cabin a trap for another soul to fade into its endless sway, a whisper that wouldn't end. Ethan and Claire were gone, not gone, but theirs trapped in the pines, a hum in the void, shadows swaying back. The cabin settled, the glow dimmed, but the hum lingered, a thread in the silence, searching for its next family. The shadows remained, unseen but alive, their rhythm A call for someone new to wander, to lose, to return a son from the pines forever.